All right, hi class. So I'm going to be instead of doing the Zoom session, I'm going to be recording lectures ahead of time that go along with the my Prezi lecture notes that I would typically do in class. I'm gonna try to do these short and per topic each week until return to in the classroom teaching. That's not to say that we won't have future Zoom sessions. I'm thinking um, maybe having a time next week once the midterm is set up, and as I mentioned before, a midterm will be later in April, just to keep an eye on the due date on Canvas. To set up a time to take question answers on lecture material from the past and on the study guide. So it'll be much more specific than you know, me giving a almost hour long lecture. I just don't think that's profitable for anybody. All right, so let me get on with this. This is basically material that's in your textbook, and that's the Phoner textbook, chapters 20 and 21. So that's what you'll be dealing with in this particular module. So, this is the Roaring Twenties. It's the era of the flapper, as seen on the cover of this Life magazine here. So you have the women with the short haircut, short dresses. So it's that kind of party time in American culture. Um, It is nicknamed The Lost Generation by Gertrude Stein, the writer, and she is actually located in Europe. So you have a bunch of writers that go to Europe. People like Hemingway, the Fitzgeralds, pictured here, Pound, Eliot, a lot of famous American writers leave the U.S. because they can't really connect with the American public because of their World War One experience, and so they go to Europe. And in a lot of ways, this is a beginning of American literary culture, at least modern American literary culture. And you can see this in the literature of these writers, but also in the music of like the jazz musicians we kind of saw with Harlem Renaissance. It becomes kind of like the thing in the early 20th century, and gets jazz itself. The jazz sound actually also migrates over to Europe. You got these jazz clubs. It is also a time, and this is one reason why probably writers like Hemingway are fleeing the U.S. It's a time of fundamentalism. So we already kind of saw some of this previously with kind of the anti-immigration backlash um, by against Chinese and Japanese, or just basically Asian immigrants, and even Asian Americans. So that's one aspect, but there seems to be, following World War One, this kind of general backlash against any kind of migration, um, and this kind of reassertion of kind of like Christian Protestant orthodoxy. So really kind of conservative Protestant Christian thought, really reacting against some modernist change. The kind of the liberation of women, um, further migration of non-Protestants into the U.S., but also generally a movement against some science technology that is kind of typical of fundamentalism today. The greatest example of that is being the Scopes trial, which basically put the topic of teaching evolution in schools on the table. So the other thing is prohibition. The selling of alcohol is actually dealt with in two amendments. The 18th, the temperance movement kind of led into the prohibition movement. So the temperance movement in the 19th century leads in a prohibition movement into the 20th century, and you actually get the banning of alcohol sale. And as you know, maybe you've learned before in the past, alcohol is being sold kind of like underground. People are still buying it. These parties are going on, so it's not like people will stop drinking. And then finally, Amendment 2021 will end prohibition, and alcohol sale can happen again. Um, Probably the most famous fundamentalist preacher of this time period is Billy Sunday. He was a former baseball player, and you can see a picture of him here. He's noted doing a lot of like theatrics in his ministry, and yeah, that's a good example of kind of like fire and brimstone type of revivalist preaching. Okay, so how do we get to from the Roaring Twenties into FDR's New Deal? Well, FDR's New Deal comes on the eve of the 20s kind of collapsing upon itself. So, um, the 20s, the presidents during the 1920s are, it goes from Harding, Coolidge, and then finally Hoover. These are all Republicans, and they are not progressive. So the era of progressivism ends with Wilson. Harding becomes president and says it's a time for normalcy. And basically, Harding and the following presidents begin this process of deregulating the market. Um, is also a time period where American industry switches to the Ford assembly line. So the type of technology and industry popping up in the 1920s are things like the automobile, the refrigerator, radios, and this is a time period where Americans are really starting to um, buy things with credit. So, again, it seems a lot more familiar to our way of life, the pluses and minuses of all that. So, eventually, the U.S. is also paying loans to European powers, particularly Germany, because of all the war and the damage that World War One had done. So the U.S. is sending out loans. So you see in the U.S. as a kind of an economic giant here. Um, it's also having to deal with the fact that communism is a growing threat, at least in the U.S. This is one of the first times where you're starting to see kind of a red scare break out because of the Russian Revolution of 1917 under Lenin and the Bolsheviks. So all this leads into 1929, where the stock market crashes. Herbert Hoover is president during this time, and it goes from bad to worse. In fact, it goes so bad that in 1932, a bunch of World War One vets march in Washington because of their bonus checks did not come in, and instead of dealing with the veterans, basically the current army pushed the veterans away, and Congress and the president basically didn't deal directly with them. So Hoover was so disliked for not quote unquote handling the depression that these little shacks that were built up by Americans who couldn't afford housing, they nicknamed them Hoovervilles. So, needless to say, Hoover will lose the presidency, his reelection campaign, to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Roosevelt goes right to work. He's the longest serving president. He I'll probably talk a little bit more about him in the next lecture in the New Deal. But this one just basically wraps up the post-war World War One, what's going on there, and how it all leads to depression, and eventually the election of Roosevelt and the beginning of the New Deal.